Okay, all right. So let's go ahead. Today we're going to talk about trust, an important topic. So thank you all for meeting with me this morning to talk about trust. So of course, as we know, trust is vital. So Ken Blanchard, one of the authors of the good old 1 Minute Manager, you all might remember him. He actually wrote a book called Trust Works, and he came up with a model that is very common sense, in my opinion, where he says that this ABCD model that he uses gives us all a common language to discuss trust and to work with one another on our trust issues. So he indicates that the A stands for able, the B stands for believable, the C stands for connected, and the D stands for dependable. And of course, when I think in terms of employees working together, when you say able, I think being competent. When you say believable, I think of somebody having integrity, being honest. When you talk about someone being connected, I think about folks being caring towards each other and towards their employees. And when somebody talks about being dependable, of course, we think about it's somebody we can rely on. They're reliable. So everybody, do me a favor. I know you all have gotten used to using Zoom, so you probably all know where the good old chat feature is. It's your little icon with the bubble there. Click on that chat feature and write into the chat box a time when you feel you've displayed one of these, and it's one of these, either being competent, honest, caring, or reliable, and it's led to you gaining someone's trust. Go ahead and take a minute and type in the chat box. I just sent you all a message, so hopefully it made it to everyone. All right. Great. Sally, I really like this. You said here that you make an effort to connect with your staff whenever they need to speak to you about anything they're experiencing, feelings they care to share with you, anything at all. So having that accessibility to you is really vital, isn't it? Your staff really appreciates that. I know the best boss I ever had was one that was completely accessible to me. And I could come in and say, I've really flubbed up, I'm having a bad day, hey, I'm really proud of what just happened, whatever it might be. I have this issue, I need your wisdom, whatever it might be. He was accessible to me, and that really made a difference. So I'm seeing some other good responses here. So we're going to share so that everybody can gain from each other's wisdom. Okay. Mike, I like this, thinking that you've displayed all of these. In particular, you really do care about the parishes you work with, right? Absolutely. And you show that, right? By what you say, by promises you make to them and deliver on them, right? You show you're dependable when you do that. Absolutely. Absolutely. So here we have Rob. Welcome, Rob. As I'm new to St. Ursula this year, you spent much of your time meeting one-on-one with all your staff. Wow, almost 70 people, with the only goal of getting to know my colleagues before we ever talk about the business of school. Really smart move, Rob. In fact, we're going to talk all about one-on-one meetings today. So you've actually, you're ahead of the game with that. So good for you. Because establishing that relationship and getting to know those people allows you to begin the trust relationship to start it, right? If you're interested in them as people, they know you're going to be interested in them as workers, as workers on your team. So I try to exhibit these qualities with each employee daily. It's been a benefit when new staff comes on board. They feel comfortable coming to me. Absolutely, Joyce, because you're one of those people who's very competent. I know that about you because I work with you closely at times. And you really do, you exhibit that competence by sharing information, by being one of those go-to people can go to and you'll get it done. And that's, and you're very welcoming to people. So it definitely shows you care. And Daphne, I try to be understanding of personal issues that affect the workplace and respond to those with compassion. Exactly. I remember years ago, I had a really tough situation going on. My husband had been deployed to Afghanistan. It was back in 2003. He was in the Air National Guard. One of my children was having a health issue, and we were going to doctors and getting tests, and they were small at the time. My sons were 3 and 6. They're now 20 and 23. But at the time, it was, of course, they were dependent on me to figure out, what doctors to take them to and all that good stuff. And I also had real upheaval going in the workplace. They had management consultants coming in and they were recommending people be laid off. It was just like everything in my world was really pretty shaky. So I was not as focused as usual at work, and I made a mistake. And I had to go to a colleague and say, hey, I messed this up. While you were on vacation, I really flubbed this up, and I need to tell you that. She was really, really angry. And she went to our boss, who was actually an interim person who the management company had put in. And she said, Molly Fern needs to be punished for this. There need to be serious consequences because she made this mistake. And he said to her, well, frankly, we're lucky Molly's making it into work with all that's going on with her right now. So cut her some slack. Now, he didn't know me real well, but boy, did he ever get my trust, right? Because he cared about me. He showed, such caring and compassion that I immediately trusted that guy, right? Even though he was an interim and not going to be there long, he definitely, I felt like he had my back. So definitely all these things are definitely ways to engender trust. Okay. I'm going to move along here. All right. So, whoops, skipped ahead. All right. So, of course, to engender trust, just like you all mentioned, you need to be available. So, as someone who's managing folks, you need to be available to them, right? I don't know if you all have had the experience, particularly with people working remotely, where you're emailing someone and emailing them and calling, and you're not getting any response, and you feel like, geez, I can't get this person to work with me. It really does wreck trust. You have to listen to people, right? That's the ultimate way to show people that you care, to listen to them. So if you feel, right, that you're not being heard, if you feel your opinions aren't taken seriously, if you feel your input isn't valued, you're not going to trust that boss, are you? Absolutely not. And you have to keep your promises. And I think we all forget how much the little promises build up to wreck trust. So even the little things can be a big deal. If we say we're going to be having a meeting at 2 and we're late, right? One time, okay. But then if we're late for every single meeting, people aren't going to trust that you're going to be there on time for anything. If you never respond to emails, or if you say to somebody, oh yes, I'll get that information to you, and you forget to get it to them, well, one time, okay. But if that's a repeated issue and you don't follow through for people, maybe it's not even intentional, but it still adds up to to cause you to really lose their trust, doesn't it? Even those little things that we promise. We want to make promises that we can keep. And if we can't keep them, we want to communicate why. Because that can make all the difference too, right? If you're unable to meet a deadline and you tell your colleagues who are counting on your work, hey, I have something that's come up, I need an extension, it goes a long way rather than just letting the deadline pass. They feel like, oh, you don't respect us enough to even tell us that you needed to miss the deadline. So that communication, even in the little things, really does add up, for sure. All right. So one-on-ones, which Rob talked about, you met with 70 people. God bless you. Good for you. So the wisdom out there in the management gurus and writing is that one-on-ones are really considered meetings that a manager has with their employees to help them develop and to help them be effective. They're really a place where employees can discuss expectations, where employees can discuss priorities, where the feedback can be offered between the boss and the employee. It can be a two-way street. And again, with all these, it can be a two-way street. And that's how we build that trust. It's also a way for the boss to offer support to the employee, just like I mentioned in that situation where I flubbed up and I felt I got great support. It's an opportunity to say, hey, I'm having a tough time, or hey, I need to do this right now because of something that's going on at home, right? People do have lives outside of work and they do need to talk about them. So there has to be a level of trust there for them to feel they can do that. And also, an employee might not be clear on what are your expectations, what are your priorities. My expectations are that I'm going to get this done. My priority is to do this, that, or the other. And then the supervisor might say, well, that's not really meeting our mission the way that I expected you to. My priority is this for us to meet the mission. So it's a place to come together and have those heart-to-heart talks so that both of you can be clear on what's expected of each other, what the priorities should be, how the work should get done, what kind of resources and help are there and support to help you when you need it. And there's an interesting book called The Effective Manager. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Manager Tools company, but it's a consulting firm and they have podcasts, Manager Tools podcasts. And these podcasts are listened to by millions of people. They've become just the gold standard for management podcasts these days. And two gentlemen who started this management tools company, one of them is Mark Horstman. Really great guy, went to West Point. He's an engineer. And so he's a big believer in you need to have the data to back up what you're saying. So he went ahead and said, I believe that one-on-ones are a good way to interact with your employees and to help them develop. And I'm going to find the data to support what I'm saying. So he did tons of research, thousands of interviews with managers and employees. And he literally figured out all these systems, and he actually gives you a step-by-step in his book. I've never seen anything so detailed where he says that you should do one-on-ones for 12 weeks. Exactly. And he actually did research and indicated that the one-on-one should be 30 minutes long only. That they should not be 20 minutes, they shouldn't be 40 minutes. He did the research and 30 minutes was the sweet spot for the one-on-ones. That it was enough time for you to get to know the employee, to get to know what's going on that week. He also did research, and I read this other places also, that a weekly one-on-one is what is recommended. That's most beneficial if it's done every week. He also indicated that, he has a whole prescribed method for you do one-on-ones for 12 weeks. And then after 12 weeks, instead of one-on-ones, you start to have feedback sessions. And for the first 8 feedback sessions, you only give positive feedback. Then the next 8, you start to introduce constructive feedback. So if you want that type of systematic, detailed kind of recipes, follow these steps to effective management, he definitely offers all that and supports it with data. It wouldn't work for me personally because it's a little too cookie cutter. I feel like we're all individuals and that some people might not need every single step of that. But I do feel the principles that he's recommending and that his data supports make sense. One-on-ones do make sense because how are we going to really develop a team that's trusting if we don't already have a trusting relationship with each person ourselves on the team? I think that's really the foundation. You've got to start off with, let me get them all to trust me as their boss, and then we'll work on, because then you'll know them all and you'll have a good sense of what their strengths are, where are the areas they need to improve, how they can come together and complement one another in a team structure. So really, it is vital, I think it makes sense, just good common sense, that you would meet with folks one-on-one first and get that relationship strengthened and that trust built. And of course, we all know, these days, the church has struggled with, as an organization, people have lost trust in us because of our troubles with the abuse scandal. So we realized how easy it is, right, to lose people's trust. I always think of it kind of like the whole weight gain situation. It can be easy to gain weight and hard to lose it. It can be hard to gain trust and easy to lose it, right? Because we don't know everybody's history. Somebody might have grown up in a household where people weren't honest with them, and they've kind of learned not to trust people. And then they're coming to work with that baggage, right? And so they might be a little tougher nut to crack it might take longer to gain their trust. And it might be easier to lose their trust. So I think that's why the one-on-ones are just really vital. Have any of you tried one-on-ones? I know Rob has done it, of course. If anyone else has done one-on-ones, if you can go in the chat and tell us a little bit about your experience with them and if they were beneficial or not, and in what way they were beneficial, I'd appreciate it. It'd be great to share with the group. Give us some anecdotal evidence here if anyone has it. Rob, if you have any insights to share, we'd love to hear them since you've met with all these folks. So feel free to go ahead in the chat and let us know. And I'll give you all a minute to type in the chat. Or if you've experienced one-on-ones yourself, if you've had a boss meet with you, a one-on-one, and you want to, talk about that and whether or not it was beneficial, what made it beneficial, what made it not beneficial, feel free to let us know that too. I think that would be helpful to share with the group.
Hey, Molly, while people are typing, do you mind if I just talk rather than type?
Absolutely, feel free.
I've been typing too much already.
I understand.
In the past weeks, I feel like that's all we're doing as in our roles, different roles in schools and parishes.
Yeah.
I certainly think, because this past week we've had to, our parents have had to decide, at least in the schools, decide what they wanted. Do they want in person or do they want remote? There was a nice third option for parents to say, if you're undecided, to have a member of the administrative team call you. Well, we all know who the administrative team member is in schools. It's usually the principal. So you end up making a lot of phone calls. I probably, I have a pretty big school. So I had about 100 phone calls I needed to make, and they weren't, typically they weren't short conversations.
Right.
So I'm only saying this because I think it is very challenging when we have the busyness of life getting in front of us, which now is busy, but boy, wait till the kids come in, how much more difficult it will be to find the time to be able to do that. I'm trying to lay a foundation because I know that down the road, the pace is just going to be accelerating with issues. So scheduled times of not only seeing teachers in the crafts of their teaching, which are going to be tough to fit in. I now need to find ways to make sure I, touch base with them on a more personal level. And at least in my role, I'm not sure all my other Catholic community colleagues here, but to me, just being present can really be one of those when you don't have the time to really be able to set aside for those 30-minute conversations, especially if you have a big group of people in which you need to touch base with. Sometimes just popping into their world versus having them come into your office, because it's a little safer, I think, when you go to their world. A lot of times people will say, can we schedule a meeting? I'm saying, sure, I'll come to your classroom. So I think it gives a better sense of comfort, even if it's a difficult conversation. So I found that to be helpful, regardless of how many people we have to meet with on a regular basis. Sometimes just being present and then, sitting in their world, which is typically their classroom or their office space.
Yeah, because it's a little intimidating even for an employee to come to the principal's office.
Yep.
Right? So absolutely. And it's really great to hear those insights. I really appreciate you sharing them. It is a huge group. And it's interesting because Mark Horstman, of course, is coming from the for-profit world. So he's kind of selling it as, I know you have a lot of reports, but this will actually save you time in the long run because they'll be clearer on your expectations. They'll trust you more, so they'll come to you when they mess up, and they'll come to you when they have a problem. And they'll know better what to do. They'll just have more direction from you. So his whole point is that, it takes a lot of time to meet with everybody for 30 minutes, but it gives everybody back time because they're so much more effective, is what his data says. So that's pretty interesting. So thanks for sharing that, Rob. And Joyce, I appreciate your input here. You're saying that you meet with your pastor each week. It really improves communication and understanding. Absolutely. Because pastors are so busy and they're running in a million directions. And so you really need to know, hey, what's the priority this week, right? What's going on with you this week? How available are you this week when people are calling in and needing you? And you meet with your facilities manager, very beneficial because then you know all the projects he's working on. He can share his challenges and absolutely helps you both to prioritize and know what things need to get done when. Absolutely. Very, very good examples. Great. So I don't know if the Mark Horstman example has given you all an idea that, gee, I want to do one-on-ones or not, but it might be worth a try. So, all right. So when we talk about a team and getting the parish or school team together and having them trust and work together as a team, it's of course a different dynamic, isn't it? And there are all types of tools that we can use to try to accelerate that trust between team members. So of course, we've all probably heard about the old Tuckman model that's from years ago, where he talks about teams have to form and norm and storm and, and that takes a lot of time for a team to do that. So in a lot of cases, management gurus will suggest that to speed up some of that process, that you do assessments, personality assessments, for example, so that all your team members have a better understanding of themselves and each other. And just by having that knowledge, it's very powerful to the team dynamics and helps inform the team on how to interact with one another. And of course, there are millions of them out there, aren't there? There's the Myers-Briggs from years ago, which recently I've heard is no longer in favor. Somebody debunked it, I think. But anyway, I've taken that a couple times in my career. There's DISC. There's, there are all these different ones. And of course, there's Clifton Strengths, which I actually am a coach for that and can administer that assessment. That's an assessment where folks can go online and do a test and then be told their top 5 strengths. And that's backed by Gallup research. So they definitely have done everything they can to validate that tool. So there are lots of tools out there that if you choose to have your team do this type of a exercise where they all do assessments and then share the information with one another, it certainly can be helpful. Particularly if you have folks who need to work together really closely and need to kind of know how each other tick, right? So it can be very helpful to do that. Some of them are geared towards ministry, some of the assessments, some are geared towards educators. I mean, they have all different types of assessments out there. And of course, some of them are inexpensive and some of them are very expensive. So, it's something to really look at and weigh. And if you would like any, thoughts on any of these assessments, I'm happy to chat with you about any of them that I'm familiar with and give you my 2 cents on them. Another exercise that's been recommended is, and I've used this myself in team building sessions, is for folks to go ahead and give a personal history so that they're being somewhat vulnerable and giving information that allows others to get to know them more quickly. So one example of that is a personal history exercise where you talk about your childhood. You talk about where you are in the sibling order and what was the one event that had the biggest impact on your life as a child. So, it's one of those things where you really get to know somebody fairly quickly. And I used this at a large gathering where there was a whole group of volunteers and some parish staff who had to come together and start to work together really quickly. And they had to kind of hit the ground running. So we did this where everybody would get to know each other fairly quickly by sharing these personal histories. And people were really very open in sharing things with this huge group of folks because the pastor started off, right? The leader started off. He was vulnerable. And so then everybody else felt comfortable to be vulnerable. So that's kind of the key with the personal histories is that whoever's the leader of the group, of the team, whether it be the principal, the pastor, that really in that kind of exercise, if they're vulnerable first, it gives everybody the psychological safety, as they would say, and we're going to talk about that further in a bit, to go ahead and also be vulnerable. So those are a couple things that folks recommend to help teams start to gel and start to trust one another. Have any of you used any of these methods or been involved in any of these assessments and found them to be helpful? I'd love to hear your insights, whether you want to unmute yourself and let me know you want to talk since we're a smaller group, or if you want to just type in the chat and let me know what you found helpful or not helpful about these assessments. Or if you've done a personal histories exercise, tell us how that went. I'll give you all a minute.
Hey, Molly,
Yes.
just in lieu of me typing again, so I hope people don't have an issue if I just.
No problem, Rob.
One of the things kind of that personal history part is, that I've kind of found some interest in, especially if faculties have been around together for a while. They think they know a lot or most about their colleagues, but that's not always typical. So I think sometimes just doing a little exercise where somebody may have to make note of something that someone may not know about them, and then you can just use that and say, okay, whatever it is, try it out for the Baltimore Ravens cheerleading team or something like that. to be able to make that statement, for them to try to identify who that might be attributed to. And then that person stand up and tell the story behind it as kind of revealing the correct answer. So I think sometimes getting people to write those things down, and then, if you just put them in a basket and then read them out, and people are trying to decide on who it's going to be. And I actually think actually helps to do something like that with a larger faculty, because we may not know some of those little minor details of people's life outside of our institutions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. People sometimes have hobbies that we have no idea about, and then they tell us and you're just amazed, right? Like, oh, you do that on the... So, and I always chuckle because we did Strength Finders. Of course, I did the Strength Finders test when I went through a coaching class for that. And I came back and I said to Joe Smith, yes, my number one strength, according to Strength Finders, is communication. And my number 34, my weakness, is analytical. And he said, well, I could have told you that without you taking an assessment. So I kind of chuckled at that because he knows me well enough that he could figure that out. But, and I see here, Mike is saying that you've done both. You found them both very helpful. You just did DISC and like that a lot. It's interesting. Mark Horstman, the gentleman who I just was talking about, who wrote the Effective Manager book, he loves DISC. And I emailed him and asked him why he found DISC to be so effective compared to Strength Finders and, Myers-Briggs, all these different tools. And he said the thing he liked about DISC was that it didn't look at past behavior as much as it looked at what can we improve in the future? What do we need to develop in the future? Was his thoughts on that. So I found that really interesting. So he really highly recommends DISC. He finds it to be more future oriented, and that's what he likes about it. So it's pretty interesting. Great. Okay, good. These are great insights. I appreciate it. I love that we can all learn from one another from these experiences. So the number one factor that makes teams effective, according to Google research, they did a Project Aristotle study where they looked at thousands of teams and tried to determine what made them so effective. They looked at the most innovative, most productive, most effective teams around the world and said, let's look at the data, because that's what Google does, right? So they said, let's look at why these teams are effective compared to other teams. And we've all been there. We've been on teams that didn't do well and didn't gel, and people were at odds, and people weren't working together. And then it ended up where just a small subset was doing all the work on the team. So they found out that the one thing that really matters in teams is feeling psychologically safe. So in other words, you feel like you can be yourself and you can go ahead and say whatever's on your mind. And that's what made the teams most effective, because everybody contributed, everybody felt they were going to be respected for their thoughts, everybody thought they were going to be respected for their opinions, nobody felt, afraid to speak up, to contribute, to offer what they had to offer, right? Everybody felt they could fully be present and be involved. That's not easy to find, and that can be tough to develop. So it's one of those things that can be a bit rare. And certainly I've been in many situations where you're in a meeting and someone says something and someone in the team disagrees and they make fun of the person, or they snipe at the person, or they tell them, oh, that's ridiculous. And it shuts that person down forever after. I've been there. You're in a meeting, you say something, somebody disagrees, you don't ever want to talk again in those meetings because you were embarrassed, or you were, your feelings were hurt, or whatever it may be that the person, put you through. So really psychological safety is key to any team being able to trust one another and be effective with one another. So the one thing that I always think of when I think of how we can communicate in a way that's safe are ground rules. And I know there are lots of different terms for these, but I call them ground rules because that's what I learned a million years ago. So just like our code of conduct tells us how to treat one another, ground rules tell a team how to treat one another. And so if you have a team working together and you're in a meeting, you're working on a project, it's always a good idea to get everybody to set ground rules together first. And it may sound simplistic, but it really does help, because if you've got the ground rules set, then you can refer back to them when somebody crosses the line. So if you've got a whole group of people and they are really feeling passionate and there are different opinions, there are ways to do that in a respectful communication style. And there are ways to do it in a not respectful communication style. So if you see someone saying something that's a bit hurtful to another person, you can step in and say, hey, that's not what our ground rules say. Remember, we're not going to make fun of one another. That's how we work in this team. As Marshall Goldsmith said, he's one of the top executive coaches. He wrote a book recently called Triggers, all about what behaviors cause us to do well and which ones cause us to fail. And it's an interesting book. But he was talking to a fellow author, and the author said the way he diffuses things is one way he's seen folks diffuse tension in a team interaction is if somebody is really coming down hard on someone, he might say, hey, excuse me, but you're not sounding like a cheerleader for so-and-so right now. And then everybody kind of chuckles, right? So it kind of resets the whole mood. So, and of course, the ABCD model that Ken Blanchard, the TrustWorks model, it gives us a common language to talk about trust. So we can say to someone, hey, you know, when you didn't meet the deadline twice, it really made me question, are you able to do this project, right? And this is causing me to not trust. So help me understand what's going on. When you ignored me yesterday and I was trying to get your attention, made me feel like you didn't care about me. And I want us to have a trusting relationship. I care about you. I hope I'm expressing that every day to you, that we work together. I want you to care about me too. Want this to be mutual. When you are never on time for meetings, you're not showing me that I can count on you. Using that trust language and having it as something we all can use together as a common language can help really take kind of some of the feelings out of that and give us a way to focus our communication when we have to deal with the trust issues. Another way to really make things psychologically safe for people is to just be vulnerable with them. Just like I said earlier, when the leader of the team is vulnerable, it gives everyone else permission to be vulnerable. Pat Lencioni gives a great example of somebody not being a vulnerable leader and how it just really backfired. So he had a group of people that he was in a meeting with. He was the management consultant. They had all done 360 feedback forms for the boss. And the boss read through them all, and then he was to meet with them and talk about the feedback and make sure he was clear on the feedback and tell them what he was committed to do. Well, instead of doing that, he said, I see here you said that I'm not very accessible. So I think I'm accessible. Don't you think I'm accessible? And of course, when he said that, they all went, oh, yes, you're accessible. They just all became, yes, men and women saying, oh, of course, boss, of course. Instead of him saying, I see here, you're telling me I'm not accessible. What does that mean? What do you need me to do differently? He wasn't open to the feedback. So again, we have to be vulnerable as leaders if we want our folks to be vulnerable with each other. We have to trust them enough to tell them what's going on with us in order for them to model that and to feel safe doing that. And that can be tough. And sometimes we have to be the ones who come to the leader and say, hey, you're not really easy to communicate with because, you know, you come across as kind of gruff with people. Now, that's a tough thing to tell somebody, but sometimes that kind of feedback can help somebody really understand that their leadership style might be getting in the way of building trust on the team. And of course, HR is happy to help with those situations if you need some conversation pointers for those kind of tough, difficult conversations. So what steps are you going to take to build trust? Go ahead and use the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and tell us all what kind of steps you plan to take to try to build some trust today, let us know.
Molly, I'm going to just share, I think, a little bit of a challenge for the times we find ourselves in. And I'm only going to use this as a trust example because
Sure.
I'm coming in and I haven't worked alongside my colleagues, and probably couldn't be a more difficult time to try to get to know people and understand them,
right,
all while we're trying to open up schools.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, I think all of our facilities have a different range of people's reaction to our schools opening up,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe similarly in parishes, but I think probably schools a little more pressing just because of the time of having less than a month to open our doors. So I mean, this has been, to me, a very difficult time for all of us who are leaders because we want to listen and hear the concerns of our colleagues. But truthfully, at the end of the day, what does it come down to? We're opening up our doors on August 31st. So you can either kind of jump in or you need to jump out. And that's tough because that doesn't sound like we're being supportive, but the supportive part comes in. We do have a job and a responsibility at this point, and the train is moving forward. So I want to help alleviate concerns and feelings that you may be struggling with, but there's still an end point to that because August 31st is August 31st. So I have found that to be difficult right now because I'm trying to build trust, but I'm still seen in this way that I'm the boss. Yet
right.
I'm having to open up school in, during these times. So just kind of leave that as a thought to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point, because people are feeling very afraid to come back to work, and we're hearing a lot of that. And it's interesting because I'm having kind of an interesting insight into the whole COVID situation because I have a part-time job in an assisted living facility, just at the reception desk. But it's really interesting because we have had to be tested for COVID, the whole staff, every week, because more and more staff members were found positive. So the executive director sent out a letter to all of us, to the families, to the residents, to us, saying, this is how many cases of COVID we've had in residents, and this is how many cases we've had of COVID in staff. And this is what we're going to do to try to combat this even further. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to test people. We're going to disinfect every single hour, every space we think will be touched, because we want to keep everybody safe. And that kind of communication really did help people, at least it helped me feel better to know, okay, this is exactly what's going on with people, right? And this is what we're doing to try to keep it at bay, to keep the infection at bay. So I think, like you're saying, Rob, just giving people information and really listening to their concerns are key, right? People have to feel heard, to feel that they can trust you. And they also have to feel that you've got their best interest at heart. So by telling them what you've done to try to prevent any infection in the school and what you're doing to try to mitigate it, that's the best you can do, right? I mean, you've got to inform and show you care. And that's really That's really what you can do, because you still have to open school, right? Right? There are going to be some places where it's essential to be open and operating. So it's definitely, I think what you're doing is laudable, meeting with everyone and doing that. Anyone else have any other thoughts about what they're going to do to build trust? Any of these ideas that kind of strike a chord with you, feel free to tell us why they strike a chord with you. Or if you feel they might not work, tell us why.
I'm going to take Rob's suggestion and just try to schedule some. I had not thought about doing one-on-ones via Zoom, just to get my staff's feelings about going back and what maybe specific support they need from me. I don't know that they will reach out to me with those concerns, but I'll try to encourage that by scheduling some Zoom meetings with them one-on-one. We've been having team Zoom meetings, but I think Rob's idea of doing the one-on-one, even though I know all of my staff, we've been working together for 4 years, under the current circumstances, there's probably some things that they might not feel safe bringing up unless I give them that safe space and let them know that I'm here to do whatever I can. So I'm going to get working on that today.
Sounds good. Sounds good. It sure can't hurt, right?
Right.
Right. Absolutely. Good ideas. Good ideas. So I know we're coming down to the wire here, so we're going to keep moving along. All right. So some of the resources that I found really helpful, I always like to share these resources with all of you, and I realize you all are very busy. The Wisdom of Teams is a pretty dense book. It's got a lot of information. So, you know, if you have time to really sit and read it, it's a little bit of a heavier read. Trust Works is a pretty light read. It's pretty short. And The Effective Managers, not even 200 pages. So, and again, that's a very systematic, you know, do this, 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 and this in order to manage your teams effectively. And he gives you the reasons why. So I find that pretty compelling that he could tell you all the data that he did in order to determine, you know, what he's telling you is most effective. Found that really interesting. So definitely there are all types of resources out there that really can help us to form our teams. And today I just wanted to touch on some of the big ideas about teams to get you all thinking about what might work with your own teams.
Molly, are you going to share the slides with us? I'm sure you may have said that. I don't know if I missed it. I can't write as fast as all of the information I want to take down. Thank you.
Sure. Let me, I can definitely, you want me to just share the slides with you?
That would be great, because it has the resources and some other things I just want.
Great. Yeah, no problem. Happy to do that. And I thought it was really interesting because good old Peter Drucker, the father of management theory from years and years ago, he is still considered, you know, one of the wisest people out there. And there's a quote from him that I thought were just some really interesting words of wisdom I wanted to share with all of you to wrap this up today. So he says here, Peter Drucker says, whenever a Jesuit priest or a Calvinist pastor does anything of significance, he is expected to write down what results he anticipates. 9 months later, he then feeds back from the actual results to these anticipations. He says, I have followed this method myself for 50 years. This method brings out what one's strengths are, where one needs to improve, and the type of improvement that's needed. It also brings to light what one cannot do. He feels these are the keys to continuous learning. So that's a pretty interesting practice. And I think I'm always, of course, a proponent of feedback. And I think that when you have a psychologically safe space for your staff, that feedback is a tool that's going to be ever vital and ever helpful for the team. Because without feedback, how do we grow, right? And that's for everybody. That's for the leader. Sometimes staff have to give their leader feedback, for the leader to give the staff. And there certainly are all different types of methods of feedback. And as he said, this is one way where you can really give yourself feedback in a very thoughtful and methodical way that I think is pretty interesting and that he found really effective. And of course, there are various ways to give feedback to your staff. And of course, I've talked a lot about Sherry Harley and her book where she gives, how to say anything to anyone. And she gives an 8-step feedback formula. Mark Horstman in his book, The Effective Manager, gives a 4-step process for feedback. In the book, The 1-Minute Manager, they give you a really simplistic way to do feedback where they talk about that you go ahead and when you meet with the person, if they've done something well, you give them a quick praising, right? If they've done something that they need to correct, you give them a redirect, and then you tell them that, you still love them as a person and as an employee, you just want the behavior to change, So it's a very simplistic way to look at it. That's a really brief book. That's a really easy read, The 1-Minute Manager. And there's actually a version of the new 1-Minute Manager. But again, feedback, I think, is really key here. And when you have a psychologically safe space, people are able to give each other feedback. And I always chuckle because people are very willing to give me feedback because I'm always telling them to. Because I've learned from my dear father that without feedback, I can't continue to grow. He always believed in giving me very straightforward feedback to be helpful. And I think that's one of the ways that we help one another the most when we're on a team, is by caring enough about each other to speak the truth in love, and it's and I think, if we say a prayer before we deliver the communication, it really can work well. And I think that it really does engender trust when you're willing to be that vulnerable to say, hey, I've been where you are, and I think this is what you need to do. I see this happening with you, and I have some advice, or I think if you would do this, it really would help you to be more dependable, or whatever it may be. We really do have to look out for one another. And so I always like to give a plug for speaking the truth in love when we're talking about engendering trust. So we only have a few minutes left. So I'd like you all to just take a moment. If you have any questions, any comments you feel would be good for the group, go ahead and put them in the chat. And also, I'd like you all to give me some feedback. And please, in the chat box, let me know on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, 1 being the worst, how beneficial was the information offered in this micro lesson class. Please share any suggestions you have, any comments you have to help improve this class. And I just want to thank you all for your participation today. I really appreciated all the insights that you offered. That's what makes learning so wonderful, is that we have all these wise people that come together. We have this great technology that can bring us together even though we're in different locations, and we can share our wisdom, and that's what really counts. That's what really makes us a church and a community that improves and does well. So I want to wish you all peace of Christ. And please feel free to go ahead and write in the chat any suggestions and your rating. I really appreciate you taking a couple minutes to do that. Thank you for your participation today. Thank you all. I really appreciate your information. It helps me. And God bless you all, and thank you for all you do for our church and our schools. Peace of Christ.